It wasn't hunger that marked the beginning of what happened next, though hunger would come to define the meaning of it all. The real starting point was something closer to contempt, wrapped in the kind of bitter humour that men use when they've lost everything except their pride. Picture it if you can, a line of prisoners shuffling through gravel in the American heartland during the fall of 1943, their worn boots making small clouds of dust as townspeople gathered to watch these defeated soldiers from across the Atlantic. These weren't fresh recruits, but veterans, men whose faces bore the marks of campaigns fought in deserts and forests, their bodies leaner than they'd ever been from months of living on rations that could barely sustain a child. Black bread that tasted of sawdust, soup so thin you could see your reflection in it, coffee made from roasted grain that had never seen a coffee bean. This was what they knew as sustenance now. Yet even in this state, even after being captured and transported thousands of miles from home, something in them refused to bend completely. Word had spread through their ranks that the American guards planned to march them past what the locals called a market, and this news sparked something unexpected among the prisoners, not anxiety or curiosity, but ridicule. There was an officer among them, his uniform still bearing traces of the insignia he'd earned fighting in North Africa, the colours faded now from sun and wear. This man turned to those nearest him with a smirk that seemed to gather all his remaining dignity into a single expression of superiority, and he spoke loud enough for several to hear his observation that back in their homeland, even the most modest farmer selling from a wooden cart could offer proper sausages, real meat prepared according to traditions older than America itself. He continued, suggesting with elaborate sarcasm that what they were about to witness would likely amount to nothing more impressive than piles of corn and perhaps some watery milk, the kind of peasant fare that confirmed everything they'd been told about this crude nation across the ocean. The men around him laughed, and that laughter rippled down the line like a current, passing from one prisoner to the next until even the guards could hear it, though the young American soldiers said nothing in response. In the minds of these German captives, America represented a kind of wealthy barbarism, a place where people might have material abundance but lacked the cultural sophistication to know what to do with it. They ate to fill empty stomachs, these Germans believed, while Europeans ate to honour centuries of culinary tradition, to connect with something deeper than mere survival. The prisoners spoke among themselves of memories that sustained them more than food ever could, recollections of Berlin bakeries, where even during the hardest times you might catch the scent of pastries if flour was available, those precious moments when sugar could be spared for something sweet. They spoke of Munich beer halls, vast spaces that echoed with brass bands and the voices of hundreds gathered around long tables, drinking beer brewed according to purity laws established before anyone could remember. Some mentioned Vienna, those elegant cafes with marble surfaces where a soldier on leave might sit with a young woman and feel for an hour that civilization still meant something, that war hadn't destroyed everything beautiful in the world. Food wasn't just nourishment for these men, it was identity itself, proof that they came from a culture that valued refinement and tradition over the crude excess they imagined defined American life. By this measure, they told themselves, they remained superior even in defeat, even in chains, because they understood what it meant to truly appreciate a meal, to see food as art rather than fuel. But underneath this arrogance, underneath these jokes and memories, something else was growing, a gnawing awareness that made the laughter ring slightly hollow. Every man in that line knew how desperate things had become back home, even if none would speak it aloud. By 1943, the daily ration for German civilians had dropped to roughly 1,500 calories, a slow starvation diet that left people weak and ill. The sausages they boasted about had long since disappeared from most tables, replaced by mystery meat stretched with fillers that sometimes turned stomachs more than satisfied them. Even beer, that sacred symbol of German culture, had been watered down in many places until it barely deserved the name, became something you drank more from habit than pleasure. Children were picking through garbage for potato skins, fighting each other for scraps that dogs would have refused before the war. Mothers stood in lines that stretched for blocks, waiting hours in all weather for butter that often never appeared, for bread made from flour mixed with sawdust and ground acorns. Yet these prisoners clung to their pride like a shield, telling themselves that what they lacked in quantity they made up for in quality, in the knowledge that came from generations of bakers and brewers and butchers who had elevated simple ingredients into expressions of national character. The guards leading them forward were mostly farm boys from places like Iowa and Kansas, young men who'd grown up knowing hard work but had never gone truly hungry, never stood in a ration line, never seen their siblings grow thin from lack. These American soldiers heard the sneering and the laughter from the prisoners but offered no response, no argument or defense. They simply continued walking, leading this column of defeated men toward the center of town where the market waited. A few townspeople lining the street exchanged knowing glances because, unlike the prisoners, they understood what was coming next. They'd seen this before, watched other groups of POWs make this same march, witnessed the same transformation from mockery to silence. The irony was almost too perfect. These proud soldiers, so certain of their cultural superiority, so convinced that American abundance was either a lie or at best a vulgar display without substance, about to confront a reality that would shatter every assumption they carried. What made the moment even more powerful was precisely this confidence, this unshakable belief that they already knew what they would find. They expected perhaps a few stalls with baskets of corn, maybe some vegetables, possibly milk in plain containers, nothing that could compare to the sophisticated markets of Berlin or Munich in their memories. They were certain that whatever they saw would only confirm what propaganda had told them, that America was a nation of quantity without quality, of crude materialism without the refinement that made European civilization superior. This certainty made them vulnerable in a way that no amount of military defeat could achieve, because they were about to discover that everything they believed about their enemy and about themselves was built on foundations far more fragile than they'd imagined. The laughter they shared as they walked was the last moment of that old certainty, the final seconds before a door opened onto something that would change how they understood not just the war, but the entire world they thought they knew. For these men, food represented more than meals. It carried the weight of national identity, of belonging to something greater than themselves. When they spoke of German cuisine, they weren't just talking about eating, they were invoking centuries of tradition, the accumulation of knowledge passed from generation to generation about how to transform simple ingredients into something worthy of pride. A proper sausage wasn't merely ground meat in casing, it was the result of specific techniques, particular spices, methods refined over lifetimes until they became almost sacred. The bread they remembered wasn't just sustenance, it was the product of bakers who understood fermentation and kneading as their fathers and grandfathers had, who could tell by touch and smell when dough was ready, who took pride in crust and crumb the way artists pride themselves on brush strokes. This relationship with food had shaped their sense of who they were, convinced them that German culture stood above others precisely because it honoured these traditions, because it refused to sacrifice quality for convenience or speed. The caricature they carried of American food culture was almost childishly simple, a crude sketch drawn from propaganda and prejudice rather than experience. They imagined meals that were all the same, mass-produced and tasteless, designed only to fill stomachs as quickly as possible so people could return to work. They pictured endless corn in every form, cornbread and corn pudding and corn on the cob, a monotonous yellow that dominated every plate. They imagined pies so sweet they made your teeth ache, coffee boiled until it was bitter and thin, meat overcooked until it lost all flavour and texture. In their minds, Americans approached eating the way they approached everything else, with efficiency rather than appreciation, with speed rather than ceremony. One soldier scoffed to his comrades that Americans ate to survive while Germans ate to remember who they were, and this distinction seemed to capture everything they believed about the fundamental difference between cultures. But this arrogance was sharpened by a terrible insecurity, because even as they mocked American food, every prisoner knew how desperately their own families were suffering. Deep in their hearts, beneath the jokes and the superiority, they carried guilt and fear about what was happening to those they'd left behind. Letters from home, when they came at all, spoke carefully around the worst of it, but the truth showed through in what wasn't said, in the brevity of messages, in the forced cheerfulness that couldn't quite hide exhaustion and worry. They knew that children were going to bed hungry, that mothers were making impossible choices about how to divide rations too small for everyone, that the elderly were quietly starving so the young might have a slightly better chance. The sausages and pastries they boasted about had become memories rather than realities, ghosts of a life that now seemed impossibly distant. Even beer, that cornerstone of German social life, had become scarce and thin, rationed like everything else, until even simple pleasures had been stripped away by the demands of total war. Among themselves, when guards were out of earshot, they traded stories and gossip about America that reinforced their sense of superiority even as doubt crept in around the edges. They claimed that American soldiers were fat and slow because all they ate was cornbread and milk, that American women couldn't cook properly and simply fried everything in grease because they lacked the skill for anything more sophisticated. An older sergeant insisted he'd read somewhere that Americans had no idea how to make real bread, that everything in their bakeries was soft and sweet like cake, lacking the substance and character of proper European loaves. These stories were a kind of armour, a way of maintaining dignity in captivity by convincing themselves that even in defeat they belonged to a civilization that remained culturally superior to their captors. They might have lost battles, but they hadn't lost their identity, hadn't surrendered their connection to traditions that stretched back centuries, hadn't forgotten what it meant to value quality over quantity. As they approached the edge of town, though, something in the guards' continued silence began to unsettle them. The young American soldiers didn't argue or defend their homeland, didn't rise to the bait of German mockery. They just kept walking, their faces neutral, occasionally glancing at each other with expressions the prisoners couldn't quite read. This refusal to engage felt somehow ominous, as if the guards knew something that made the prisoners' jokes irrelevant, as if they were letting the Germans talk themselves into a corner from which there would be no escape. A few of the more observant POWs noticed townspeople watching them pass with what looked almost like pity, and this was even more disturbing than anger would have been. Why would these Americans pity them? What did they know that the prisoners didn't? The unease grew with each step closer to the market square, a prickling awareness that perhaps their assumptions were about to be tested in ways they hadn't anticipated. Pride is always loudest just before reality intervenes, and these men were about to experience that intervention with a force that would leave marks lasting far beyond the war itself. They were seconds away from a revelation that would strip away not just their arrogance, but their entire understanding of the conflict they'd been fighting, the nation they'd been serving, and the world they thought they knew. The laughter that had carried them this far was about to die in their throats, replaced by a silence so profound it would echo through the rest of their lives. Then they saw it, and everything stopped. The first glimpse of the American market hit them like a physical blow, stealing breath and words in the same instant. They'd been expecting something shabby, perhaps a few wooden stalls in mud, maybe some produce arranged without care, the kind of provincial market you might find in any small town anywhere. Instead, they walked into what seemed like a cathedral of abundance, a space so bright and clean and full that it overwhelmed the senses. The morning sun poured through tall windows, catching on polished floors that reflected the movement of shoppers like a mirror, creating an atmosphere of light that made everything seem to glow from within. The building itself spoke of permanence and prosperity, solid construction and careful maintenance, nothing temporary or makeshift about it. But it was what filled that space that truly devastated them. Stalls stretched away in every direction, row after row of food displayed with a casualness that seemed almost obscene to men who'd known scarcity. Red meat lay in perfect cuts, the marbling visible in the flesh, glistening under lights as if each piece had been polished. Mountains of vegetables rose in pyramids of colour, green and orange and yellow and purple, still wet with morning dew that caught the light like jewels. Apples and peaches sat in baskets so full they seemed about to overflow, their skins shining as if someone had buffed each individual piece of fruit, their fragrance drifting through the air strong enough to taste. Crates of fish rested on beds of ice, their silver scales catching reflections and throwing them back, looking so fresh they might have been swimming minutes before. Bottles of milk stood in ranks that seemed to march away toward infinity, so white and pure they almost hurt to look at, each one identical and perfect. For several heartbeats, no one in the line of prisoners spoke. The laughter that had filled the air minutes before evaporated like steam, leaving only stunned silence in its wake. One young soldier, barely 20 years old, whispered something so quietly the men around him almost missed it, asking in a voice filled with disbelief whether this was truly happening during wartime, whether any nation could possibly have so much while fighting across oceans. His question went unanswered because no one else could find words either. Every man, too, occupied with trying to process what his eyes were showing him against what his mind had been taught to believe. The guards still didn't speak, didn't gloat or point out the obvious. They simply stood to the side and let the Germans look, let them take in the full scope of what America meant by a market. Housewives moved among the stalls with their children, shopping bags over their arms, examining produce with the kind of casual attention you give to routine decisions. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts and pointed at candies wrapped in coloured paper, at cookies displayed behind glass, at treats that seemed limited only by desire rather than availability. Shopkeepers greeted customers by name, weighing meat and slicing cheese and bagging purchases with unhurried movements, taking time to chat about weather and neighbours and ordinary concerns that had nothing to do with war or sacrifice or survival. What broke the prisoners most completely was the realisation that this wasn't theatre, wasn't staged for their benefit or arranged to impress foreign captives. This was simply an ordinary day, a normal morning in a normal town where people came to buy food the way they always had, without fear or desperation or the grinding anxiety that comes from never knowing if there will be enough. The abundance wasn't special, wasn't noteworthy to anyone except the Germans watching in silence. To the Americans shopping, this was simply how things were, how things had always been, how things would continue to be tomorrow and next week and next month. The war might be raging across the world, American boys might be dying on beaches and in jungles thousands of miles away. But here at home, life continued with a normalcy that seemed impossible to men whose entire existence had been consumed by total war. For prisoners raised on stories of a weak and decadent America, propped up by propaganda that insisted their enemies were soft and unprepared for real hardship, this scene was a kind of betrayal. They'd been told that the United States was fighting beyond its capacity, that American civilians were suffering nearly as badly as Germans, that the vaunted industrial might of the New World was a mirage that would collapse under sustained pressure. Yet here, in the heart of supposedly struggling America, was a market that surpassed anything these men had seen, even in the best days before war. Even in the glory years when the Reich seemed invincible and prosperity touched every corner of the nation. This wasn't survival, this was comfort, this was life, lived without the constant calculation of rations and calories and whether there would be food tomorrow. One officer felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached, his hands curling into fists at his sides as he struggled to maintain composure. Another found himself staring too long at a cheese counter where dozens of varieties sat in wheels and blocks and wedges, their sharp smell reaching him across the aisle and making his mouth water despite his will to remain unmoved. A sergeant muttered something bitter about families back home standing in lines for scraps, while here milk waited unused, so much of it that some would likely go unsold, would be discarded rather than fought over. His words fell into the silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples that touched everyone near enough to hear. This moment, though it lasted only minutes, cracked something fundamental in these men. It wasn't yet complete despair, that would come later, but it was the first real fracture in certainty, the beginning of understanding that what they'd been taught about America bore no relationship to the truth. The brightness of that market hall, the casual abundance, the unstudied plenty, all of it cut deeper than any battlefield defeat because it revealed that the war had never been the contest they'd imagined. They hadn't been fighting equals who might triumph through superior will or courage or commitment. They'd been fighting a nation whose resources made mockery of everything the Reich had claimed about its own strength. The devastation deepened as they watched more arrive. The stalls were already overflowing, every surface covered with food, every basket full to bursting, yet trucks continued to pull up to the loading bay at the back of the building. Drivers in work clothes shouted instructions to each other as they unloaded crate after crate, box after box, sack after sack, adding to mountains that already seemed impossibly high. Oranges arrived by the hundreds, butter in quantities that would have fed a German town for weeks, flour in such volume that it seemed impossible to imagine all of it being sold before more arrived to replace it. One prisoner who'd worked as a baker's apprentice in Hamburg before the war felt something twist inside his chest as he watched bread being unloaded. Fresh loaves, golden and still warm, their crusts crackling, their interiors soft and white, dozens of them treated as if they were nothing special. He remembered his hometown bakery during the last year before he'd been conscripted, remembered how they'd been forced to stretch flour with sawdust and ground acorns, how the bread had turned grey and tasted of nothing, how children had come to the back door with empty hands hoping for crusts that never came because there was nothing to spare. He remembered the shame of telling those children no, of watching their faces fall as they turned away hungry, knowing there was nothing he could do. Now he stood watching crates of beautiful bread being stacked like firewood, sold openly to anyone with money, no ration cards required, no limits, no lines, no tears. An older sergeant from Cologne couldn't stay silent anymore, muttering under his breath about children at home fighting over potato peels, while here they built pyramids of food that reached toward the ceiling. His voice carried enough bitterness to quiet the men around him, because they all knew he spoke truth. They'd all received letters describing the same desperate scenes, the same impossible choices families were forced to make. No one laughed anymore. No one made jokes about American cooking or crude American tastes. The mockery had died completely, replaced by a sick understanding of how badly they'd been deceived. The numbers, had they known them, would have made the comparison even more crushing. By 1943, American farms were producing more than 350 million bushels of wheat annually, enough to feed not just the nation, but to ship massive quantities overseas to allies who desperately needed it. American dairies poured out over 100 billion pounds of milk every year, while German families back home were diluting theirs with water to make it last another day, to give children something white to drink, even if it barely qualified as milk anymore. These statistics remained invisible, locked in government reports and economic analyses, but their physical manifestation stood before the prisoners in the form of stalls groaning under the weight of abundance, trucks arriving with still more, an endless stream of production that seemed to have no limit. And through it all, the Americans maintained their maddening casualness. A farmer in denim overalls unloaded crates while whistling some tune the Germans didn't recognize, his movements unhurried and relaxed. A teenage boy stacked apples into neat displays, occasionally tossing one into the air and catching it again just for the pleasure of it, treating food as if it were abundant enough to play with. An elderly woman examined tomatoes with the kind of leisurely attention you give to decisions that don't really matter, picking up one and putting it back, choosing another, taking her time because there was no pressure, no fear that if she waited, someone else would snatch up the last decent vegetables. To the watching prisoners, this behavior was somehow worse than if the Americans had been hoarding or desperate or afraid. The casualness, the lack of appreciation for what they had, felt like an insult layered on top of the injury of captivity. These people had so much food that they could afford to be picky about it, to waste time choosing between options that all looked good, to discard what didn't meet their standards, because more would always be available. While German mothers were teaching children to eat everything on their plates, no matter how unappetizing, to waste nothing because there would be no seconds, American children were allowed to be fussy, to leave food uneaten, to ask for treats and sweets as if such things were normal rather than miracles. Some of the prisoners tried to rationalize what they were seeing, to find explanations that wouldn't shatter their entire worldview. Perhaps this was just for show, one officer suggested weakly, a special display arranged to impress foreigners or boost morale or serve some propaganda purpose. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang false. You couldn't fake the steady stream of trucks arriving with new supplies, couldn't stage the relaxed chatter of shoppers who clearly did this every week, couldn't manufacture the smell of fresh bread and ripe fruit that filled the air with an intensity no illusion could match. The sheer scale of it crushed any attempt to explain it away as temporary or artificial. In that prolonged moment of recognition, the prisoners began to understand they weren't simply witnessing a marketplace, but standing inside the machinery of a nation whose productive capacity dwarfed anything they'd imagined. This wasn't just about food, though food made the lesson visceral and undeniable. It was about the fundamental resources available to each side, about industrial might and agricultural output and the ability to sustain a long conflict while maintaining quality of life at home. For the first time, real doubt began to seep into their certainty about German victory. Because how could you defeat a nation that could feed millions without apparent effort while simultaneously fielding armies across multiple continents? The most painful realization, though, wasn't the abundance itself, but the utter indifference with which Americans treated it. Every basket of fruit, every loaf of bread, every cut of meat felt like a miracle to the watching Germans. But to the shoppers it was simply Tuesday morning, nothing remarkable, nothing to celebrate or comment on. Housewives walked the aisles with their lists, checking off items with the bored efficiency of routine. A mother handed her child a candy stick as casually as if passing a pebble, not because the child had done something special, but simply because the child asked and candy was available, and why not? A farmer's wife bought a sack of flour and a jar of honey without even glancing at the price, secure in the knowledge that her budget could handle it, that the same products would be there next week, that there was no need to stock up or hoard or plan desperately for future scarcity. The Germans watched this performance of normalcy and felt their pride curdling into something heavier and more bitter. They remembered endless queues back home, women standing in snow and rain with ration cards clutched in numb fingers, hoping that by the time they reached the front of the line there might still be half a pound of butter available, knowing that often there wouldn't be, that they'd wasted hours for nothing. They remembered children with faces that had lost their roundness, cheekbones becoming prominent, eyes seeming larger in thinning faces, the visible evidence of bodies consuming themselves for lack of adequate nourishment. Yet here in America, people behaved as though food were as certain as sunrise, as dependable as gravity, requiring no anxiety or calculation or desperate planning. The contrast was unbearable in its starkness. One prisoner, a school teacher from Dresden before the war had claimed him, found himself fixated on a small boy tugging at his mother's sleeve and asking in a clear, confident voice whether he could have peaches. The mother sighed, not from worry about cost or availability, but from mild exasperation at the request, then nodded and handed the child 2 fresh peaches without ceremony. The boy bit into the first immediately, juice running down his chin in golden rivulets, then carelessly tossed the pit aside before starting on the second. The German teacher felt his hands curl into fists as he watched, because in his city he'd seen children fight viciously over orange peels, had watched them cry when such treasures were taken away by larger children, had witnessed the desperate hunger that made even garbage precious. To see a boy treat such luxury as nothing special, as something to be consumed and discarded without thought, left him feeling physically ill. The guards continued their policy of silence, But that silence grew weightier as minutes passed. For the POWs, this refusal to comment or gloat somehow made everything worse, because it confirmed that the Americans didn't consider this abundance worthy of notice. They weren't showing off or trying to prove anything. They were simply letting the prisoners see normal American life, and that normalcy was more humiliating than any deliberate cruelty could have been. It meant the United States had so much, was so secure in its productive capacity, that even feeding prisoners of war decently in camps posed no threat to civilian supply. The thought burned in ways that defeat in battle never had. Whispered conversations began among the prisoners as they tried to process what they were seeing. Some insisted it was unfair, that America's vast land and rich farms gave them an advantage that had nothing to do with cultural superiority or deserving. Others suggested grimly that this was the real weapon of the United States, not its tanks or bombers, but its ability to feed its population without fear, to maintain morale through plenty, rather than having to rally people through sacrifice. The gossip spread through the ranks like sparks catching on dry tinder, small bursts of speculation and rationalization as each man tried to fit this experience into a framework that wouldn't shatter everything he'd believed. One prisoner joked bitterly that if Americans fought with loaves of bread instead of bullets, Germany would have surrendered in the first month of war. The joke fell flat, greeted with wan smiles rather than laughter, because underneath the humour lay a truth too painful to acknowledge directly. Another fell completely silent, just staring at the overflowing baskets, with an expression somewhere between wonder and despair, his face unreadable, but his posture suggesting a man watching his faith in everything collapse. What lingered most powerfully, though, was precisely that sense of routine normality. For Americans, this plenty was ordinary, expected, the baseline against which everything else was measured. For Germans, plenty had become a fading dream, a memory of better times that seemed to recede further with each passing month. That gulf between experiences, between what each side considered normal, was devastating to contemplate. It suggested that the war wasn't just a conflict between armies, but a mismatch between different worlds, one where abundance allowed life to continue almost unchanged, and another where every day brought new deprivations, new sacrifices, new reasons to wonder how much longer people could endure. And for you listening now, try to imagine standing in that position, confronting abundance that pierces your soul like a weapon precisely because of how casually it's displayed. Can you picture the confusion of emotions, the tangle of anger and envy and shame and despair that must have filled these men as they watched children eat what their own families could no longer provide? If you had been one of those prisoners, having mocked American markets only minutes before, what would have gone through your mind as reality demolished every assumption you'd carried? These aren't academic questions, but invitations to understand that history isn't just facts and dates, but human experiences, moments when individuals confront truths that change them forever. By this point, every trace of the arrogance that had carried the Germans into town had evaporated like morning dew under harsh sun. No one laughed, no one sneered, no one made even the weakest joke about corn and watery milk. The elaborate performance of European superiority, the carefully maintained fiction that German cuisine and culture stood above crude American excess, all of it had been silenced by the simple fact of stalls stretching away in every direction, heavy with more food than seemed possible during wartime. Rows of meat and vegetables and fruit still surrounded them, but what remained in the prisoners wasn't shock alone anymore. It was something deeper and more corrosive, a humiliation that settled into bones and would never quite leave. A lieutenant who'd once boasted about his father's butcher shop in Bremen, regaling comrades with stories of sausages hanging like a forest and customers lined up for specialty cuts, now lowered his eyes, unable to meet anyone's gaze. He whispered, almost speaking to himself, though others heard, that the Reich had thrown every ounce of strength into this war, mobilized every resource, demanded every sacrifice. Yet still families at home went hungry, while here there was enough to feed even enemies, even prisoners who'd tried to destroy this nation. His words fell heavy as stones, carrying the weight of confession, and those near enough to hear felt the sting of recognition because he'd articulated what all of them were thinking, but none wanted to speak aloud. What they'd witnessed was more than food on shelves. It was a mirror reflecting the collapse of every illusion they'd carried. In Germany, propaganda posters had promised that the fatherland was strong, that sacrifices were shared equally across all classes, that victory would bring prosperity to reward those who'd endured hardship with patience and faith. Yet here in this market square of an unremarkable American town, truth stood naked and undeniable, revealing that America possessed resources so vast that war had barely dented its supply, that the home front continued with normalcy that would have seemed like fantasy to anyone living under rationing and scarcity. The numbers, had anyone told them, would only have deepened the despair choking them. By 1944, the United States would produce more than 130 million tons of grain, 23 billion pounds of beef, tens of billions of eggs, an output so massive it seemed to belong to a different planet rather than a different country. Entire fleets of refrigerated trains carried food across the continent every day, a logistics operation that dwarfed anything Germany had achieved even at the height of its power. Meanwhile, back in the fatherland, rations for civilians had shrunk to 1,200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life, leaving people weak and vulnerable to disease. The Wehrmacht itself fought on half-empty stomachs, while American families still drank milk by the gallon and threw away leftovers without guilt or concern. The officers, once so proud of their heritage and culture, could no longer meet each other's eyes. Some turned away from the stalls entirely, unable to bear looking at abundance that made mockery of everything they'd been taught about their own nation's strength. Others stood rigid, jaws clenched, fighting to keep despair from showing on faces already marked by defeat. A young corporal began muttering a prayer under his breath, the same words his wife had written in her last letter before he'd been captured, a simple plea asking that Providence keep their children from hunger. The prayer felt hollow here, surrounded by evidence that some children would never know hunger while others would never escape it. Among the prisoners, the gossip and speculation that had filled earlier moments dried up completely. The jokes had withered into silence. In their place grew a thought that some tried to suppress but couldn't quite banish, the terrible awareness that if this was what America had in its small-town markets, in unremarkable places that didn't even rate mention in geography books, what possible hope did Germany have of winning this war? Their nation had mobilized everything, conscripted every able body, rationed every resource down to the last gram, pushed its people to the absolute limit of endurance and beyond. Yet still it fell short. Still it couldn't match what America accomplished almost effortlessly while fighting across two oceans simultaneously, while maintaining abundance at home that made war seem distant and abstract rather than all-consuming. This represented the real turning point for many of them, more significant than any battle lost in Africa or bombers that had destroyed Hamburg or news of retreats on the Eastern Front. Those were military defeats, painful but somehow comprehensible within the framework of war's fortunes. This was different. This was the quiet humiliation of watching a mother buy butter without fear or calculation, of seeing children eat freely while your own starved, of understanding that the entire economic foundation on which the war effort rested was built on sand compared to the bedrock of American productivity. Pride didn't just crack, it shattered completely, replaced by recognition that their world had been smaller than they'd believed, that they'd been fighting a giant while thinking themselves equals. And for those listening now, consider what breaks a person more completely: the sound of enemy guns that might kill you, or the sight of children eating bread and fruit without worry while your own family subsists on scraps. Which wound cuts deeper, the physical injury of battle, or the psychological devastation of watching your entire worldview collapse? These questions matter because history isn't just written in victories and defeats, but in the silences where pride finally gives way to truth, in the moments when individuals confront realities they'd spent years avoiding. Tell me in the comments what you think, because these conversations keep history alive, prevent it from becoming mere dates and statistics, remind us that every great event was composed of individual human experiences, each one as complex and painful as our own. Years would pass before the war finally ground to its bitter conclusion, but the memory of that day in the American market lingered in the minds of former POWs like a wound that refused to heal properly, always tender, always ready to ache when touched. For many veterans returning to a shattered Germany, the most haunting images of captivity weren't barbed wire or guard towers or even the moment of surrender, but those stalls of food they'd once mocked with such confidence and then beheld in stunned silence that felt like drowning. In post-war Germany, when men gathered in taverns reconstructed from rubble or spoke quietly to children born into a divided nation, the subject returned with surprising frequency, as if by telling the story they might finally make sense of what it meant. One old soldier, by then working in a Stuttgart factory and trying to forget he'd ever worn a uniform, told his grandson about that day in a voice that still carried disbelief decades later. He explained how he'd once laughed at the very thought of American markets, how he'd been certain they were filled with nothing but corn and thin milk, the crude fare of a crude people. Then he described standing before endless stalls brighter than any dream, understanding in that moment with sudden clarity why the war had been lost before it truly began. His grandson, born into a Germany of ration cards and rebuilding, of occupation zones and the slow, painful work of reconstruction, listened with eyes wide as the old man's voice cracked slightly on certain words, evidence that time hadn't dulled the memory's edge. Others wrote in letters they never sent, in diaries hidden in drawers, and discovered only decades later when families cleaned out attics after funerals. A corporal confessed in ink, faded brown with age, that his faith in the Reich had shattered not on any battlefield, not during any bombardment, but in front of a cheese counter in Iowa, watching varieties he couldn't name piled high, while back home people would have fought for a single piece. The diary was small, bound in black cloth that had worn thin at the corners, and when family members uncovered it in the 1970s, it still smelled faintly of the barracks where it had been hidden, a ghost scent that connected present to past. He'd written that he thought they were fighting equals, other nations like their own, but instead they'd been fighting giants who fed their people as though war didn't exist, as though abundance was a natural state requiring no effort or sacrifice. These recollections, scattered across memoirs and oral histories and family stories, reveal something profound about how war is experienced versus how it's remembered. Battles are fought with weapons, strategies are executed with troops and tanks, but the moments that burn deepest into memory often have nothing to do with combat. For these men, a loaf of bread on a shelf, a child biting carelessly into a peach, a woman buying butter without calculating whether the budget could stretch that far. These became the symbols of defeat more powerful than any surrender document or prison fence. They weren't just reminders of what America possessed, but revelations of what Germany could never achieve under the system they'd served, under leaders who'd promised prosperity through conquest, but delivered only scarcity through war. The symbolic power of that market hall grew over the years, rather than diminishing, becoming almost mythical in veterans' minds. To some, it represented the moment their pride collapsed, the instant when arrogance gave way to reality, and they had to confront how thoroughly they'd been deceived about their enemy and themselves. To others it became strangely hopeful in retrospect, proof that the world could be abundant, that humanity might live without constant fear of hunger, that perhaps the future could be different from the past if the right systems were built. Yet for all of them, regardless of how they interpreted it, the memory remained unforgettable, carved deep enough that even dementia in old age couldn't entirely erase it. Imagine it yourself, after years of war and propaganda, after months of hunger and cold, after believing absolutely in the superiority of your culture and the rightness of your cause, to stand before aisles of food so vast they seemed to stretch into eternity, to watch ordinary people shop without fear or desperation, to realize in one devastating moment that everything you'd been taught was a lie? Would you laugh? Would you weep? Would you simply stand silent as these men did, unable to process the gap between expectation and reality? That question haunted every prisoner who'd made that march, became a puzzle they turned over in their minds for the rest of their lives, seeking some explanation that would make the experience comprehensible, some framework that would let them integrate what they'd seen into a coherent understanding of the world. And the final image that lingered across decades was always the same: sunlight spilling through tall windows across a market square, stalls groaning under the weight of fruit and bread and meat and milk, the ordinary chatter of shoppers moving without urgency or fear, the casual abundance that spoke of a strength beyond anything they'd imagined. For German prisoners of war, that picture burned brighter in memory than any battlefield, became a symbol of power and humanity that outlived the war itself and shaped how they understood not just their defeat but the nature of the conflict they'd participated in. It revealed that wars aren't won only through military might, but through the capacity to sustain populations, to maintain morale, to prove through daily life that your system works better than the enemy's. The story doesn't end in that moment of shock, though, because its implications spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. For those men, the sight of abundance represented more than just humiliation or revelation. It became a kind of education in how power really works, a lesson that military academies don't teach, but that history demonstrates over and over. They'd been raised in a world where propaganda painted enemies as decadent and weak, where strength was measured primarily in battlefield victories and territorial conquest. Yet what they witnessed proved that real power lies not just in armies, but in the ability to feed populations, to maintain infrastructure, to keep civilians secure and comfortable while simultaneously waging war across multiple continents. The market was more than commerce. It was proof of a society that could sustain conflict without consuming itself, that could fight total war without demanding total sacrifice from its people. This was the secret of American power that no propaganda could acknowledge, because to admit it would be to confess that the entire German approach to war was fundamentally flawed. You couldn't build lasting strength on conquest and plunder, couldn't sustain a long conflict by stripping occupied territories and starving your own population in the process. The American model, so mocked by German officers, turned out to be far more resilient because it didn't require its people to choose between supporting the war effort and feeding their families. Both were possible simultaneously, and that fact made all the difference. Decades after the war, when historians interviewed surviving veterans about their experiences, the market story emerged repeatedly as a pivot point, a moment when understanding shifted from abstract to concrete. One former officer explained it like this, that he'd known intellectually that America was wealthy, everyone knew that, but knowing it as a fact and seeing it as a physical reality were different things entirely. Standing in front of those stalls, smelling fresh bread and ripe fruit, while remembering his family's last desperate letter about dwindling rations, made the abstract concrete in a way that destroyed every comfortable illusion he'd maintained. It wasn't just that America had more, it was that they had so much more that the comparison made Germany's efforts seem almost pitiful by contrast. This understanding, this realization that wars are decided as much by agriculture and industry as by generals and soldiers, would shape how these men viewed the world for the rest of their lives. Some became pacifists, convinced that war itself was futile because modern conflicts would always be won by whoever could produce more rather than whoever fought harder. Others became advocates for European integration, believing that only by pooling resources and ending ancient rivalries could the continent hope to compete with superpowers like America. A few maintained their bitterness, nursing resentment about unfair advantages and geographic luck, unable or unwilling to see beyond the loss of pride that day in the market represented. But perhaps the deepest lesson was simpler and more universal, that strength doesn't announce itself through boasting or mockery, but through quiet demonstration. That true power lies not in dominating others, but in caring for your own. The American shoppers in that market hall weren't trying to prove anything to the prisoners watching them, weren't even aware that their ordinary lives were delivering such a devastating lesson. They were just buying groceries, feeding their families, going about their lives with the confidence that comes from living in a system that works. That confidence, that unthinking security, proved more powerful than all the marching and saluting and propaganda Germany had produced, because it was real rather than performance, substance rather than show. For you listening now, the story invites reflection on how we measure strength in our own time, on what truly matters when nations compete, on whether we've learned the lessons that history offers or are doomed to repeat the same mistakes in new forms. Can you imagine how different the world might have been if those German soldiers had seen American markets before the war started? If they'd understood what they were really facing before the first shot was fired? Would it have changed anything, or does human nature require us to learn certain lessons only through painful experience? These aren't rhetorical questions, but invitations to think deeply about what this story means beyond its historical moment, about what it tells us regarding power, propaganda, and the gap between what we're told and what's true. The strength lies not only in force, but in the ability to nourish, to provide, to make plenty seem ordinary. And that lesson remains as relevant now as it was in 1943, when German prisoners stood silent before American abundance and finally understood what they'd been fighting against all along.